Welcome back to the stage, all three of you. And to get underway with the questions, I'd like to put one first up to Archbishop Mark, but we can have contributions from other panellists as well. And this one is about a matter that happened fairly recently. In fact, our questioner says, addressing the end of a formation for new bishops at the Vatican last Friday, Pope Francis called newly appointed bishops to be icons of mercy. Our questioner says, what do you think that means?
I think in the same talk he said they're not to be princes but to be pastors, which was why I deferred to Sister Veronica in this magnificent chair in the middle. Looks very princely.
Which I agreed with completely.
No, but look, you've got to understand what an icon is, and an icon isn't just a nice religious picture. It's the embodiment of that which it represents. In other words, certainly in the Eastern churches, the icons are a kind of sacrament almost, as we would say. So that in other words, what the Pope means when he says that people like me, and indeed everyone that I'm looking at here or there, is to be an icon of mercy, is we're not just to be a pale representation of mercy, we are to actually embody the mercy. We are to incarnate the mercy, because that's what an icon does. It's not unlike what St. Paul says at the beginning of the letter to the Galatians, where he said, when God was pleased to reveal his Son in me, is what he dictated. Now, in other words, he becomes the good news. He becomes the revelation. He doesn't just pass it on or talk about it. He actually becomes the revelation. So in that sense, what the Pope is saying is people like me, have to become the mercy. And you see, that's what we see in Pope Francis. He talks about the stuff, but he actually embodies that which he talks about. So he himself, I think, is clearly functioning as an icon of mercy. Now, he's not saying you've all got to be like me. Just as St. Paul says, you don't have to all be identical to me. But in your own way, you do have to embody the mercy and become the revelation.
Does any other panellist wish to comment on that?
Yeah, it seems to me that we all need to be icons of mercy, and our leaders need to embody that in a special way, and I think that's what the Pope is saying. And so we forgive and we accept forgiveness, and we acknowledge our own need for forgiveness. We are compassionate and we receive compassion. We are gracious and we honour the graciousness, treat others with respect. I think all of that is part of being an icon of mercy. And while I find it wonderful, truly wonderful and inspiring that the Pope says that these are the qualities that are needed in our church leadership, I'm taking it to myself. In whatever role that I have, I think we need to be icons of mercy. If we say anything about mercy, then we must embody it.
The other thing just that occurs to me listening to Veronica is you're never going to become an icon of mercy unless you're able to receive mercy. And you'll never receive mercy if you don't see the need to receive mercy. So the first thing a leader has to do is to acknowledge her or his need for mercy. That by which I live. Do this and you will live. So it's not an optional extra for a leader. It's absolutely essential. Our leadership lives by receiving mercy and then passing on what we have received and letting it take hold of our whole being.
Okay, a question now to Phil, to bring him into the conversation. With regards to mercy, we focus on what we can do to help the poor, which is noble, and by all means we should do it. However, if we talk about forgiveness of those who wrong us, we are not good at doing it. As church, how can we teach ourselves to involve forgiveness much more?
Right. Look, I think it's we saw a bit of that in the in those mercy moments, whereby various people under those various reflections were allowing themselves to be open to the encounter. So I know, and Bill, who's particularly talked about the person who came to his door and he went after, and what actually happened was the conversion of heart for people who were in the home. I think sometimes we make a mistake if we think it's all about us going and doing good things. It's got to be deeper than that, and it's us being open and being honest to that encounter. And if that's the case, then we also have to be able to, really apologise occasionally for where we have wronged people, from where we are part of the problem, and we've got to admit that before we can move to being part of the solution. And I reflecting on the experience in Kiribati last week, saying to an assembled throng of Kiribati people, I said, look at me, I'm a white Australian Western male. I'm sort of the problem that you people are living lives that basically we have helped to create. So it seems to me that there's an honesty that's required here, an openness, and an openness to conversion. Because if we're going to hear the truth, it's going to be from those people at the edges. It's not going to be at the metropole or the centre.
Just again, what strikes me listening to Phil is that without humility you don't get to first base. And in a sense, that's what you've been saying. You certainly don't get to the first base we call humanity. And in the end, that's what this is all about, is being a human being with a heart of flesh and not a heart of stone. When I was younger, I used to think the easiest thing in the world that happened just automatically was that you became a human being. I don't think that anymore. I now think it's the greatest of all arts. In a world that's full of the living dead and hearts of stone, to be a real human being with a heart of flesh is the great challenge and call. But without that sense of humility, not grovelling in the dirt, but that real sense of oneself as a wounded human being, there's no way I can have the heart of flesh that reaches out to embrace others who are wounded.
Yes, and I think that as church, we're only learning to do that, to admit our mistakes. We were very slow to say we got it wrong. But we are beginning to do that now, and I think we will be a humbler, more merciful church as a result. It took until the 1890s with Pope Leo XIII to officially acknowledge that we had it wrong with slavery. Now, we are beginning, it seems to me, to acknowledge that we and our leadership, that all of us can make mistakes. And I think that there will be more mercy in the world, that we will become, because it is become merciful as your Heavenly Father is merciful. It's not be merciful. We have to keep becoming. And so we're on the way if we acknowledge that we need forgiveness ourselves for there to be mercy in our world.
And to
Sister
be
Veronica, a question directed specifically to you, but others are welcome to comment as well. Could you please speak a little more about the notion of mercy as womb compassion, and in relation to God, how this might shift our thinking about the type of God that we follow?
Thank you. We have tended to think of God literally as male. And we've used, there are more male images for God than there are female images. But this is a female image. It's predicated not only of women but also of men. It's a parental notion, but it is womb compassion. It's unapologetically and undeniably a female image. God is said to be, in Exodus 34, verse 6, God is Rahum, womb compassionate, Vehanun, and gracious. And so often, womb compassionate, predicated of God, used of God, is linked with other notions. So we get a sense that womb compassion, there's a little bit of womb compassion in chesed, another way of expressing mercy, and a little bit of chesed, steadfast love, or I like to translate it as enduring love, a little bit of enduring love, in womb compassion. And I like to read the Psalms and to read the Hebrew and get in touch with those, just allow it to be part of me, so that I get more closely in touch with who God is. So I think just simply, sometimes we neglect the Psalms. In the liturgy, we have a tendency to replace the psalm in the Sunday liturgy with a song that has nothing to do with the readings and nothing to do with the lectionary. And it seems to me it would be, there are many mercy psalms, psalms with, and God's steadfast love endures forever. That's not rachamim, that's chesed. But there are many so-called mercy psalms. And I'd love to see us take the psalms and pray the psalms more seriously within our liturgy. And then I think that will help us to understand God, or the God of our tradition. God, that is God for me, more deeply. I don't know.
I think we had a simple but powerful image of that enduring love and maternal love in what Lillian Chan said in that mercy moment that we've just seen. Looking at her baby daughter, no matter what that child did or how frustrated Lillian herself might have felt, that the love endured. And the purity of that love of parents who greet the newborn child. The child's done absolutely nothing to deserve it, but it's there. And if you need any proof of God, there it is.
And she picked up the story of the son who wasted his inheritance and came back, and that parent is said to not to have womb compassion, but to have a visceral response, which picks up that whole Hebrew notion of rachamim.
And there's no mother in that story.
Well, there is, but behind the scenes.
Behind the scenes.
Yes, and that's.
But I always loved the Rembrandt's famous painting of it, of course, where the father is shown as having the two hands, one of which
Yes.
is patently masculine, and the other seems to be feminine. So the interplay of father and mother in the God figure, which is profoundly biblical.
Just a thought in listening to that sort of debate and also looking at the question in this, if you like, battle of the sexes between
Careful.
definitions and understanding and the delivery of compassion. It's usually the mother who's, in theory, more understanding in families, whereas it's always wait till your father gets home, so to speak, in terms of the really significant discipline. Is that something that maybe we really should be addressing within the home in terms of really starting to inculcate the right attitude to both groups, both the males and females, in terms of where we go?
I think there are some tough mothers out there. No, but I think the traditionally male and or masculine and feminine roles in families are being redefined.
Yes.
That
So
the
they
allocation of duties is certainly part of that.
So
You
they
might know
should.
more about this than
Well, I
I
hope
do,
so.
Phil.
I hope so. I mean, I hope so. But I think if there's one thing we've been short of collectively as a global species, it's been love. The type of unconditional love. I mean, it was St. Augustine who said, how late have I loved you? You know, I think we haven't summoned up enough love collectively to work out our approach to the first peoples and the last to arrive, for example.
But-
And I think the clue into that is that notion of familial parental love, that the people who we isolate, there but for the grace of God and the luck of the roll of the dice go all of us, which has got a well up compassion rather than judgment, and it's a very significant reason why, for example, the refugees and asylum seekers are pushed aside, hidden at the edges, given numbers not names. Because you don't put a name to a face-to-face to a name, you can't develop the relationship. There's where the conversion comes from. And so I think those structures are there absolutely to keep the love out. That's what we've got to do, the exact opposite.
But it's fascinating too that the traditional description of the church as mother, which again is profoundly biblical. And some people object, say in the liturgical text, the use of she or her for the church. But I think you have to understand why that is there and what's being said when the church is being described as mother. I think one of the things that is emerging with Pope Francis, in some ways paradoxically, is a more maternal church. And he recently put out a document called Like a Loving Mother, Come una madre amorevole. So it's worth us pondering a little bit on why the church is called mother and what that means and what that calls us to.
Phil, if we could come back to you on this one.
Uh-huh.
In the face of the refusal of any political party to challenge Australia's refugee policy, what can the individual do to institute change? Probably worth considering this to some extent on a broader perspective on the grounds that there is pressure, as you know, from within our own political system and also its supporters outside to actually have the Australian policies adopted by more countries overseas.
Yeah, which would be a disaster if that was to happen. As I said, it's a luxury for Australia to sit back at the bottom of the earth and say, well, we've got to close our doors in order to make this work. I think that there's a lot the individual can do. There's a hell of a lot. And I'd say, firstly, politically, a member of Parliament for many, many years standing who resided not far from this building said to me once that for every phone call I get, it's 1,000 people who wanted to ring and didn't. For every letter I get, it's 2,000. And for every visit, it's 4 people who didn't. Because Australians, you know, we tend to engage with the process, rail against the TV screen in the evening, but not necessarily take that next step of doing something about it. So certainly, if the politicians say to me, oh, yes, mate, I think you might be right, but we don't hear it from the punters. So I think one of the first things we can do is let your senators, let your local MPs know that this is an issue of concern to you. We've seen recent polling at the Refugee Council, for example, that says 24% of the population support the government, 21% of the population support the position that I'm espousing. But in the middle is about 58, 59% of people who want to see something better, but want to have that promoted and pushed, right? So I think we've got to take that sort of action, firstly, politically. But secondly, a bit like we saw in the Mercy moments, we've got to invite people in. So, you know, if you're having a parish or you're having a school, let's not just talk about refugees and asylum seekers, bring them in, meet them.
That
Develop a
comes back-
relationship with people.
But that is what Pope Francis calls a culture of encounter.
Yeah.
And it's what you talked about before. To do the things we're doing, and the same could be said of the Indigenous, and the same could be said strangely of abortion, you've got to deny the humanity of the other.
Yeah.
It was like what happened in Nazi Germany with the Jewish people. The first step to the death camps was the denial of their humanity.
Yeah.
Now, once you start doing that, you're on a big, dark, slippery slope. And that's where the culture of encounter is crucial, because
Absolutely
you
right.
meet them, they've got a face, they've
Yeah.
got a name, they're a human being. And it's far harder to put them on islands
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and do all that other stuff.
It's
if
interesting
you know 'em.
mentioned. It's interesting you mentioned the Holocaust. I was in Auschwitz about a month ago. I haven't been there before. I'm not going to go back again. But it was absolutely chilling to think how that happened. I've done some work in Rwanda over the years after the massacre, and in Cambodia when I was at Caritas. And to try and get your head around how can humanity do this? Now, the Anti-Defamation League in the United States did some research into this, and they come up with this thing called the Pyramid of Hate. And it starts with the horrors of genocide. You know, Cambodia, Rwanda, Sri Lanka, and the Holocaust, of course. And people were justifiably absolutely offended, you know, and horrified by this. But they worked out that it starts, a bit like what Mark's saying, of prejudicial attitudes that basically says, well, it's okay to boo Adam Goods. You know, that basically racial stereotypical jokes or avoidance of someone because they're different to you, that leads into prejudicial actions where you might start telling those sorts of jokes. And that leads into discrimination, which leads to violence, which leads to genocide. And the theory goes that you get people to write down the incidents of things they've heard of those prejudicial attitudes. And you get lots of them. And then what you've seen for the genocidal behaviours. And then you grade them. And hey, presto, you get a pyramid. you know, and you can't have that horror of the death camps or Cambodia unless it starts at the denial of the humanity. So all of us, whatever part of the world we're watching this at the moment, can be part of the change. So the individual has a fundamental role to play in terms of not just what they do or who they meet, but who are they going to be? You know, and be the change you want to see. I think Michael Jackson said that. Well-known prophet.
I think you can, I don't think we can do very much alone, but we can join with others. I belong to a group in Ballarat called Frogs. Now, we are friends of grandmothers against children in detention, the detention of children. We wear purple. Now, we can wear purple all the time if we like, and I try to wear a little bit of purple, and I bought that coat that's sitting down there on over my chair when I joined the Frogs. The Frogs, friends of the grandmothers, wear a green badge. The grandmothers wear a purple badge. And it's gaining momentum. It isn't huge in Ballarat. It wasn't begun in Ballarat. It was begun by somebody called Claire Forbes in Melbourne. But it's operating in various parts of the country. And it's amazing what the Frogs do in terms of raising people's awareness, even those who can't walk in the street with their walkers. And that's what they do. And it's amazing how many friends of grandmothers there are, young people who can run into the shops as we go down the footpath, as we go along the street. The younger people will run into the shops with leaflets and so on and tell them about what's happening. And then the council, the Ballarat City Council, has been very much, very supportive of this. And some of them are willing to speak at the gatherings.
Local councils fabulous.
And I think that's local councils is a way to go. That's just one example, but they can also keep us informed. If I'm away for something, then through social media and through all sorts of ways of communication, they use every imaginable form of communication, and their grandmothers or great-grandmothers.
Back to the maternal strength. But the point it is about local councils is that right across Australia, from Fremantle to Cairns down to Tasmania, hundreds of local councils are now refugee welcome zones. So a lot of and state governments are doing similar things. It's the federal government that's the main problem. And I guess local councils, state councils are closer to their people. And if you think about where those big changes have occurred in the last 50 years, it's been people's movements, the women's movement, the peace movement, the environment movement, the anti-apartheid movement. What characterises those movements is where people of faith and of no faith come together to take action around shared values, collective action. Now that's happening right across the country regularly. I'll put in a plug for the Refugee Council of Australia, who monitor this and promote it right across the country. There's so many things people can do other than just rail against the television.
Despite some of the very positive aspects, I suppose, that we've looked at today in terms of mercy as we shared it with everyday people in everyday lives, as we did in those mercy moments just a little while ago, a question here that I think is one that probably resonates with many people at the end of a session like this. The writers say, often some of us leave conferences like this one, beating ourselves up about what we don't do. The question goes on, in Paul's letters, he always greets people with thanksgiving for who they are and then encourages them to continue. How can we recognise and acknowledge mercy already at work in our lives, in our families, and in our parishes?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. Mind you, Paul doesn't always start with Thanksgiving. He bashes up on the Galatians right from the start. He's in white-hot anger when he writes to that mob. But the point is a very good one. There's a lot more going on than we might think. And a lot of it is not dramatic in any conventional sense. But then mercy isn't dramatic in any theatrical or conventional sense. It's one of the things I was seeking to say in my presentations. And I think it's one of the things you see in Pope Francis. A lot of it is ordinary stuff. But that's its power. And I know, because I go around the parishes of my large diocese, and you see the fantastic things that are being done, often behind the scenes. Or I think of the St Vincent de Paul Society. Again, they don't blow the trumpet and bang the drum, but it's one of their greatest strengths. So I think it's the point of these conferences, and I say that not only to people here, but to all of you out there watching, is not to have people, walk away beating themselves up because of what they're not doing. I mean, there is the call to do more and to be more, but at the same time to build upon the immense legacy of mercy that is there in the church. And for none of our faults and failings can cancel or deny that fact. So I think it's a very useful thing to say at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Sister Veronica?
At a recent Josephite conference, it was their sesquicentenary, titled A Running Jump, I was very moved by people that we might say are people on the edge, vulnerable people who spoke and who spoke so powerfully. And I think I come back to what Phil was saying before, that we need to listen to these people. We need to get to know them and then provide a context where others can meet them and know who they are, and they speak for themselves, and what they're doing for one another is also extraordinary. I mean, one of the things that impresses me hugely is how families manage on so little, like the allowances that they have and how they manage and how they have their children looking so beautiful and clean going to school, but they are living on so much less than most people in our community with
Totally.
their
89% of special benefits.
yes, yes. And then, like, you become aware that they're not buying medicines. They're not having their scripts filled out because they're not getting the concessions that some of the rest of us get. And then when people know that, when they hear that, they're wondering why the child is still sick. She's been to the doctor, and that was a free service, but then the parents had to wait to fill out the script. A child with toothache, they seem such small things, and if their neighbours only knew. So it seems to me that Phil's idea of getting to know people and providing context, and I think we do have in the church, we have buildings, we have meeting places, and if we can just open them a little more for the purpose of being there for one another and allowing them to engage with one another, then that would shift and make us a much more merciful world and a more merciful church.
While listening to you speak there, Veronica, I just was struck by, and I don't say this to flatter you or any of the religious women who are here, but religious women, in fact, I think have made an extraordinary and unique contribution and still are. And again, in some very obvious ways, the great ministries of healthcare and education, but I know that there are religious women of all ages out there doing the most extraordinary works of mercy, and they're not all sisters of mercy like you either. So
No, that's right.
I think that just has to be recognised as a huge contribution, both past and present.
And I just, in the conclusion, just to run off that a bit, was, Veronica's reminding us of the non-use of exclusive language is terribly important. And but I think that is creating space for mercy. We've got to also reclaim the language that we use collectively. If you listen to the debate in Australia, it's easy to think we live together in an economy, not a society.
Yes.
And that's significant because if you live in an economy, you're a customer or a consumer before you're a citizen. And if you're a customer or a consumer, well, then you have choices based upon how much access to the folding you've got. And as Veronica's just espoused, that's in no ways equal. But if you're a citizen, you've got rights and responsibilities, and that to each other. So I think the language we use is terribly, terribly important. When you fly to Melbourne, you're a passenger, you're not a customer. When you go to the bank, the bank should be providing service and not selling products. Because when we use that language that excludes the person on the other, or the person that's poor, well then, as Miroslav Volf said, you're denying the otherness of the other, you're denying the existence of God straight up. So I think we've got to reclaim the language. You know, I was at an educational conference recently where a guy was out from the States, and he was saying, you know, you got to make sure you communicate effectively to your stakeholders and deliver to the shareholders their dividend. And I got up afterwards and I thought I said, if I walked into the conference at BHP or something in London, you know, and I said, stakeholders and shareholders, I think he's talking about parents and their children. You know, I think we've got to realise that we've got to keep the person in the conversation, and in the language that we use that doesn't isolate and therefore make it easier to say to asylum seekers or Indigenous peoples, well, you are what you do, not who you are.
I think that brings us back to the Pope's language of care for our common home. And that whole thing, like economy, we're an economy. Economy, you know, it comes from oikos, the care, the rules of the household, if you like, and ecology. I think that's the umbrella, you know, the care of, so social justice, environmental justice, the cry of the earth, the cry of the poor, the cry of the poor, the cry of the human poor, the cry of the earth. And I think that we need to understand some of this language in a new way. Care of our common home, I find a marvellous subtitle for that encyclical that was produced between the announcement of the Year of Mercy and its inauguration and our living out the Year of Mercy. I think they have to be seen together, and this conference has brought them together. Cry of the earth and the cry of the poor.
Yeah, and that's integral ecology, I think, is the phrase the Pope cobbles together in
Chapter 4.
Laudato Si. But, you know, in other words, for the scripture, words create worlds. That's really what we're saying. Language is power. They're not just sort of empty labels, words. Words create worlds, and therefore we need to forge a language of mercy. But one of the things that came to me very strongly during the Synod in Rome last year that I attended was the call to a new listening for the sake of a new language. We need a new quality of listening in order to forge a new language, because a lot of the language that we use is itself either dangerous or it just doesn't communicate.
Yep.
But I don't think we'll ever come up with a new language as required unless we engage in some kind of new listening, particularly to those whose voice is so often unheard.
Yep.
We're almost out of time, but perhaps just a very quick reflection for a few seconds from each of you, the message that you would like to leave in terms of having wrapped up the conference today and furthering this important message of mercy as dictated by the Pope.
I think we in this part of the world and in many other parts of the world are at a point as the church where we can no longer just stick up a sign saying business as usual. I think we are crossing some kind of threshold without being too apocalyptic about it, and I think we will only cross the threshold safely and creatively if we take on board the call that is coming not just from Pope Francis but through him from God to become a more merciful church with all that means in an increasingly merciless world. And in the end, if I could repeat what I said at the start of today, that our only credential in the end is the good news. And the good news is mercy. It's not just part of it. Properly understood, it is the good news in Jesus.
Sister Veronica?
I would want to say that we have a wonderfully rich biblical tradition in relation to mercy. And I think it's important not to underestimate the power of prayer, of meditative, contemplative prayer, breathing in the mercy, the tender mercy of our God, breathing it into the whole of our being and breathing it into our world. And I think if we become more contemplative in all of this. We will be more attentive to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor.
Phil?
And don't give up. History tells us change happens. History tells us, and I guess it's a decision that all of us have to make, is what side of history do we want to be on when that change comes. And I fully agree with what Archbishop Mark has said, and Veronica. But it's pretty simple, you know, love one another as I have loved you. And if we can somehow manage to get that right, I think the sorts of issues that we break it up into will be a lot simpler to sort out.